Hello, all.
Hello.
Hope everybody's having a great day.
Great day.
So far, so good.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Mayor Vaughn. How
Hi,
are you?
Mayor Vaughn.
How are you?
Doing great.
Good way to end the week.
Yeah.
I'd say so. Okay, so it's about 2 after, and I am confident that there will be a few more people trickling in, but I certainly want to be respectful of time. Here it is Friday afternoon, and this group has given me the best part of a Friday afternoon, nonetheless, which is the last tail end before the weekend kicks off. So I want to be really mindful of that because I want you to feel vested and I want you to be engaged. And I know that the best way to do that is to at least start on time. And so with that in mind, I want to welcome you to this workshop that I've entitled Serving with Perspective, Boards and Commissions Sensitivity Training. My whole goal is to have some engagement and some dialogue around the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion as it pertains to this public volunteerism work that you do. That in mind, couple of housekeeping things. We've got 2 hours to talk about something that we could take 2 days, 2 months, 2 years to talk about, right? And so with that in mind, in order to kind of stay on schedule, in order to expedite, you will all be muted periodically throughout the workshop, and you will use the chat to offer comments and questions. Now, my due diligence on my end of the housekeeping is that I will pause periodically for Jody to review those so that we can make sure that we're answering questions in as much of real time as possible. But also the goal is to make sure that your comments are heard and that we can allow you to elaborate on those comments when you so desire for as much as time allows. So right now we're in the ballpark of about 20 some odd participants. Yesterday, we ended up with approximately 40 something participants. And so, of course, the larger the group gets, the more cumbersome dialogue can be if we're not, somewhat orderly. And so that's why Jody is here to support. Zaina Afada is on the line. They are both staff with the Human Relations Department, and they will be assisting me today to make sure that I'm able to acknowledge as many of your questions and comments as possible. Jody is the Education and Outreach Coordinator for our department, and Zaina is our fellow from the UNC School of Government. She's been with us 1 year, and we have the pleasure of having her with us again this year. And so that's really a wonderful opportunity for us as far as building those relationships with School of Government, those new budding professionals. So definitely glad to have Zane on board as well. So my name is Dr. Love Jones, and I have been with the City of Greensboro for 7 years. And I can say that my fervor for the work of human relations or serving as the leader of the human rights arm of the city is no less intense than it was when I walked in the door, if not more intense, probably. I really care about these topics. I'm very passionate about these topics. And so to the very best of my ability, I'm going to try to walk us through some of these ideas that will help us in our roles as we serve the community. And so I would be remiss if I didn't take the time to acknowledge council presence on the call. We have Mayor Nancy Vaughn. Thank you so much for being here. I don't recall seeing any other council members at the moment. I know we had a few on yesterday. And so for all intents and purposes, if can't acknowledge them at the beginning, I will acknowledge them at the end. And I want to acknowledge them especially because this is an initiative driven by the council. This is an expectation driven by the city council, those who appointed you to these boards and commissions. And so again, thank you for the opportunity. It's important for us to kind of know what we're looking down the road of as far as a workshop, right? And so with that being said, I want to cover some of the just a general overview of what we will be working on today. So first, we're going to cover why sensitivity training even matters for public volunteers. You know, what is the purpose? What is the goal? And then we're going to talk about defining privilege, a working definition of privilege in public volunteerism. And then after we work through that, kind of comb over that working definition, then we're going to talk about social awareness in public volunteerism. And then finally, addressing bias. And it might look a little redundant even on the screen to see in public volunteerism repetitiously, but I want to drive home the point that this is not just your general diversity, equity, and inclusion training, your general sensitivity training. This is steeped in your role as a public volunteer, steeped in your role as a board member or a commission member. And that's really important because sometimes with the diversity, equity, and inclusion type trainings, the goals can be so lofty and the context can be so broad that when it comes down to how to do the work and some of the how-to pieces, that can get lost in translation. So I thought it was important for us to stay very specific to this context. So let's dive right in. You know, why is sensitivity training necessary for public volunteers? Well, first, it's because every City of Greensboro board and commission serves the public. And our public of 270 some odd thousand people is pretty diverse by race, ethnic origin, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, educational background, but the list really goes on. This is a really diverse community. And what's important to note is that in all of that diversity, all of the identities that may be represented on a board or a commission may not be shared with that plethora of identities in the general public. So here you are, one of 9 in most instances. I know some boards and commissions have more or fewer people, but in theory, you're one of 9. And in that one of 9, the council has chosen you to represent a sector of 200 and something thousand people. And so when you talk about sensitivity training, it's more about making sure that public volunteers have this sense of understanding of all of the people that they represent. And in many instances, there will be commonalities, and then in other instances, there might not be any commonalities at all. But it doesn't change the fact that you are indeed that representative that is chosen to liaise. You do this bi-directional work between members of the community and the council. You learn from and educate the community, you learn from and educate the council, and all of that is in the name of making Greensboro a really incredible place to live where people can thrive. So the other reason why sensitivity training is so necessary for public volunteerism is because every board and commission has a focus on quality of life. So whether it's the transportation board or if it's the human relations commission or perhaps it is, you know, a board or commission through like Friends of the Library, whatever body it is that you serve on, it's still getting back to how do we offer the best of what Greensboro has to offer for all of our community members. It's a quality of life work. And so then anytime you're talking about quality of life, you're always talking about human rights. And some people may debate that and say, I don't know, because in the lens of the work that I do as a volunteer, we're not always talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and access, but are you? At the end of the day, any of those aspects of quality of life, you are talking about these three things listed in this second bullet. That is equality, diversity, and inclusivity associated with access or provision or opportunity. And so the prevailing question of board and commission work to the third bullet is, who gets access to what, when, and under what circumstance? That's what boards and commissions deliberate over all the time, whether we support a piece of property being zoned in a certain way, or if it's about whether or not there is agreement about ways to increase access to libraries. Whatever it is, it's always about access to what, when, and under what circumstance. And ultimately, that question is about deciding what is best, in air quotes, for the community. And the reason why I emphasize best in air quotes is because best is relative. And we all are aware of that. And so, I'm confident that anyone who decides to give their time in a voluntary capacity doesn't come in and say, I hope I just do all right. Some days, sometimes. No, commissioners and board members come in to do their best on behalf of Greensboro. And so the key is understanding the nuances, the variation in identities and lived experiences, so that best really can encompass as much of the population as possible. So it's critical to consider these multiple lived experiences that, again, you may or may not share. And so sensitivity training is designed to simply cultivate ideas and thoughts about how to consider the other. Other, not in the negative sense of othering as a verb where it's you at the center and then everyone else over there, but just an awareness of the person whose story is connected to mine in some ways and disconnected in others. We wish that there weren't centers and margins, right? We wish that it was about every person in this city having the exact same amount of access, at least in theory. And sensitivity training is designed to remind people that that is indeed the goal. Because many times we can only bring ourselves to the table first. And in bringing ourselves to the table, we may have an inclination to make decisions or to engage people or discuss topics through what would serve those who are like us, because that's all we know. And so as a public volunteer who's chosen, again, usually one of 9 on behalf of 200 and almost 80,000, it's really important for us to think about these things on a regular basis. And so the last point at the bottom of this slide, I think, is really important to note. No decision about access leaves the system unaffected. And so this reminds me of an experience in my development. I was maybe about 12 or 13 years old, and I had a friend named Melinda. And Melinda and I were like super, super tight one summer, to where I was at her house almost every day or every other day. And in being at her home, her father had this really strong philosophy that there was no daughter of his that was going to know less about a vehicle than his son, because she was one of 2. She had a brother. And from the time that they were like 8 years old, they began working on cars. So, of course, when people come over to Melinda's house to hang out, you might catch her on the tail end of one of her mechanic sessions. So she's in full mechanic regalia. She has like the zip up jumper and everything, and she's sliding in and out from under the car and in and out from under the hood. And, ultimately, it was kind of fascinating, all these things she knew how to do. But what you didn't know is that if you came over to the house, more often than not, you were going to get recruited. So true to form, here I am, all 5'1" of me in this mechanic's jumpsuit that was clearly designed for someone at least 6 feet tall. I was about 13 or 14 years old, maybe 13. And interestingly enough, one day I'm underneath the car with Mr. Quick, and he's looking over at me and he's explaining all of the pieces and parts underneath, all of the systems underneath the car. Then we go underneath the hood, we go back underneath the car, we come back up, and he says, "That's a bolt on the ground." And I said, "It seems it is." And he said, "Did you forget to tighten the bolt?" And I said, "I don't think so." He said, "Don't you think you should know?" And I said, "Well, it's not like the whole car is gonna fall apart." He said, "The whole car won't fall apart before your eyes if you don't tighten this bolt. But every system in this car can be affected by you not tightening that bolt over time." And I never forgot that. Now, am I underneath cars on a regular basis? No, but I have applied that to my life philosophy, and I really see it relevant in this work on sensitivity training with board members and commission members. Board members and commission members are chosen to tighten the bolts, to make sure that the system that is Greensboro runs in an effective way for everyone, because the system is made up of the people who thrive in it. And so when you talk about tightening the bolts of what's going to make Greensboro a great place to live, those decisions about access really are critical to making sure that this system works the way that it is supposed to for every person who resides in this city. So that's the essence of why sensitivity training is so critical. What I want to do now is venture into this idea of privilege. And after that, we're going to station break for some questions and some comments. But I want to venture into this concept, this idea of privilege. What is privilege? Well, there are all kinds of textbook definitions of privilege. And as a scholar in the area of cultural studies, I spent the bulk of my education studying power and privilege. But for this workshop, I'd rather develop a working definition. And that is simply, as you see up here at the top, the ability to be unaware. Privilege is simply the opportunity to be unaware. So here to the right, you see a picture of someone with a muffin and a measuring tape. And how many of you, by show of hands or head nods or maybe laughter, how many of you know someone who can eat practically anything on the planet and they never ever seem to gain a pound? Mind you, this is not your gym rat. This isn't the person who is on the host of supplements and, drinking celery juice every morning and getting a good cleanse. This isn't the health conscious person. This is the person who literally can eat burgers and fries, wash it down with an entire cake, and somehow manage not to gain one single stinking pound. Like, all of us know at least one person who falls into that category. What I know for sure about myself is that I am not that person. But perfect metabolism Patty never has to think about what's consumed. Never. And so when you're talking about being unaware, it is a privilege that she does not have to think about what she eats. Now, what makes this interesting is that there may be moments where perfect metabolism Patty is the person who gets to pick where we're having lunch for the month. We all have, work groups pre-COVID that used to get together regularly and sit down at a restaurant, maybe once a week or maybe twice a month. And so this is perfect Patty's month to choose where everyone's eating. And she has a favorite nostalgic spot, McDonald's. 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce and cheese, onions and pickles on a sesame seed bun. Perfect Patty gets to pick where everyone eats. And when she chooses, she sends out a text and she says, "Hey, everybody, you know what day it is? McDonald's at noon." And if you're like me, I am literally counting calories when I consume water. So I'm like, I don't know if this is going to work out for me that, every week for this month, I'm going to be eating at McDonald's on Friday. So some advocate of the group taps Patty on the shoulder and says, hey, Patty, just want you to know we got a few people in the group who are really not keen on, consuming McDonald's every week, watching the waistline, if you know what I mean. And Patty says, oh, no, it's cool. I've got it. Checked. McDonald's has new salads on the menu. Now, I am not going to claim to be a salad connoisseur, but I am going to offer that of all the places where one can get a salad, that McDonald's may not be at the top of the list every time, not to mention the fact that the list for McDonald's and salads is like yay short and everything else on the menu is like yay big. And so what that does is it creates a situation where Patty, unaware of what she consumes, unaware of the impact, because it doesn't have much of an impact for her, she thinks she's chosen well for everyone. She thinks she has chosen something that is good enough for everyone. Now, that is a simplified example of unawareness. But imagine what that looks like as a board member or a commissioner. Now, I want to walk you through an example of awareness that is very personal to me, actually. I was leaving elementary school. I had two best friends. One was Asian and white. The other was German and white. My friend who was Vietnamese and white was my best friend. My friend who was German and white was like second best friend, if that's a thing when you're a kid. And I had been to her house for a pool party the weekend before. Her parents decided to have this big bash to end elementary school, as I show my age, because middle school was not a thing. So going to 7th grade meant junior high. And so everyone was super excited about this pool party that was going to turn into a sleepover. And indeed, I was all packed and ready to go, went to her home, changed clothes, jumped in the pool. We had a blast, ate hot dogs to our heart's content, and it was a great night. So 7 days later, it was such fun that 7 days later, her parents decided she could throw another party to kick off the summer before 7th grade. Talk about like tolerance. So here it is, everyone's all abuzz about this party that's coming up in another week, and it's going to be another sleepover. So we're all at the carpool section of school in the front, and I walk up last and I see that my friend who's German is completely tear-stained in the face. I see that my friend who's Vietnamese is angry. So I ask, what is the matter? What's wrong? And she said, my friend who's German and white, she said, my mother's a bee. She used the expletive. And I was totally appalled for several reasons, because I'd never heard anyone call their mom that. Number two, this is the carpool section. So I am out looking like radar around the semicircle to make sure my mom is nowhere in sight, because I do not want her to think for a moment that I am the one who said it, because I know that I was going to get assaulted right there in the front of the school for calling my mother an expletive. So I didn't even want to be incriminated. But I'm fascinated. I'm like, your mom's a bee? Like, who says that? So then my friend who's Vietnamese echoes it in full-fledged agreement. Now I'm just taken aback, because I know, one, that maybe you don't call your mom an expletive, but if you do, it turns into fighting words if someone else calls your mom that. But my friend is in full agreement. So I'm very confused at this point. I was like, A, why are we calling moms this? And B, why yours? Because your mom's nice. And she said, well, not only is she a bee, she's a racist bee. And I was like, whoa. I was like, your mom's not racist. Your mom is really sweet to me. And I was just at your house. So your mom is not racist. And she said, yeah, you were at my house, but you can't come back. And I said, what do you mean I can't come back? She said, you can't come back, period. And it's because you're Black. And I said, well, how did you decide? How did this even come up? And she said, well, I don't even know all the details, but all I know is that you're Black and you can't come back, and now I don't want to have my party at all. And so it's not that I wasn't prepared for this moment. My parents fully equipped me with the reality that one day, already being aware, but that I would have to become more aware of how people felt about my racial identity. Well, as it turns out, her mother was not a racist, much less the expletive attached to it, but her father was. See, in all of our hanging out together over those 3 or 4 years we had been in school together, we had always done things outside of the home. We did gymnastics together. We did all the other activities together, but I had never been to her house and she had never been to mine. So her father assumed that the little girl named Love was named so by her white hippie mother. Well, he had the hippie part right because my mom is a hippie, but he didn't have the white part right. So his back is turned and he's flipping hot dogs. He looks over his shoulder and he sees this little black 12-year-old baby jumping in his pool. And he says to his wife immediately, "I'm not going to cause a scene. She can stay, but she better not ever be in my house, not another day after this." So her mother had to do the dirty work of explaining that I wasn't invited. And it wasn't until much later that she learned that her father was the one who had given the directive. As life would have it, just the irony of life, when her father passed away, her mother married our Black gymnastics coach. So all in all, I guess you can say that life just kind of has a way of coming full circle. But in that, I became aware very early of the fact that I would be received differently and that I had to make decisions about how I felt about that and how I would navigate that. So the question of the hour is being unaware a bad thing? We've got 2 examples on the table. I'm going to argue no, not altogether. It's what we do with awareness and unawareness that's the difference maker. But there are moments when we are unaware. One moment for me comes often as it relates to my education. Hanging out on a patio with a group of friends, having a conversation about wellness, some topic. I make a statement and someone looks over their shoulder and they say, "Well, listen to her, she's a doctor." And I'm like, pause. 1, I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm not a medical doctor. And the person said, "Oh, I know." I said, "No, I'm like a PhD. I only know a lot about like one thing. I study like a lot about like this one thing and that's it. And it's culture and people. It's not really wellness." I was just making a statement. And this person was adamant. They said, "No, I get it. Okay, fine. I know what your doctorate is in, but you have a doctorate." And pretty much that's it. And it never occurred to me that anyone would look at my education as a way of labeling me as an expert across all things, that there would be some sort of respect given to my desire to learn a whole lot about one thing, which is what a doctorate is, and that they would kind of transfer that across all bodies of knowledge and give me credence in that way. So I was totally unaware of the privilege, of the way in which that privilege had been absorbed and then scattered in that moment. So there are times when there are identity markers that we possess that may be laden with privilege, but because we don't see it as privilege, it's not until we see how other people embrace it or absorb it or acknowledge it that tells us that a moment of privilege has happened. But in the end, the key is to acknowledge that indeed privilege is a thing and that it is the ability not to be aware. So when we're talking about this notion of unawareness, privilege and public volunteerism is kind of the opposite of that. Privilege and public volunteerism is the ability to be aware, because with awareness comes responsibility. And so when you're making decisions on behalf of other people in order to make Greensboro the kind of community everyone wants to live in, that is a privileged responsibility. It is all about knowing and being aware of different experiences that may or may not be like yours, that still need to be represented at the table when decisions are being made. And it's really, really critical to see that as an opportunity more so than a burden. Because if it's seen as a chore, like most chores, what do? We delay them. We put them off. If we see something as a chore, it's like, I'll get to it later. And the thing about inclusivity and being sensitive to the needs of the community is that there really isn't a later. All we have is now. And so this notion of privileged responsibility is paramount to how one does their work. And with that being said, I want to pause. I haven't seen any, at least I haven't been made aware of any activity in the chat, but I definitely want to open the opportunity for question and comment. Jody, is there anything listed? Because I can't see the chat box.
No, ma'am. No one's left any comments.
Okay. With that being said, are there any comments or questions that people have as a result of what they've heard about this idea of privilege, and that the working definition is to be, is basically to be unaware? Are there any thoughts about that? Any ideas?
Comment?
Sure.
Yeah, this is Raleigh Stout from the CSC. I was thinking about this being unaware. There is a way to be just uninformed and not yet aware, and then there's the being aware or being made unaware deliberately by choice, which sounds a lot like elite obliviousness. Can you see a connection there?
Well, certainly there is indeed a difference in being uninformed and being unaware. And then there is a critical point where once you realize that you're uninformed or unaware, that you seek awareness. So in the wake of the things that we have happening right now, the city has taken on a strong initiative to make sure that these kind of sensitivity, diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations are happening across the city staff just as much as it's happening with our front-facing volunteers. And in those trainings, I have a particular question that comes up that says, when did you know that race was a thing? Like, when did you become aware of the fact that race was even a construct? And for as many people like myself who received all kinds of acknowledgments of racial uniqueness and the talk and all of those other things from a very early age, there were just as many people who said, I'll be 100% honest. Race was not a thing, and it wasn't talked about because where I lived, no one looked any different from me, like from age 0 to 18. It wasn't until adulthood that I actually even encountered people that were a different race from my own. And as a result, the conversations about race always, ended up, somewhat awkward because that wasn't something that I had been groomed to do. So certainly there are information gaps that come with sheer existence. Sometimes if everything around you is pretty homogenous, everything looks the same, is the same, then getting introduced to difference doesn't happen until it happens. But there is a critical point where, if nothing else, media and or general encounters in the public teach you a little bit about the difference between you and the rest of the world. Now, that could be through the lens of race. It could be about being differently abled. It could be about gender differences. It could run the gamut. But at some point, we encounter difference, even if we don't understand the difference. And at that point, Raleigh, to your point, it certainly is ideal that you would seek out the opportunity to learn more and to become aware. Sadiqa, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes, I don't know if there is any connection, but I didn't know about black and white until I came here to the United States. And first time when I applied for work, and I found that I have to put black or white, or I found myself that I treated as black, but I didn't know about it until I came here.
And that's another thing, is that, we live in the South where, especially around racial difference, at least, it's pocketed in a binary. There's black and white. But we live in one of the most diverse communities in the state as far as international presence. And so it's also critical that when we start thinking about difference, we also consider ethnic origin and the fact that people who arrive here in the States and arrive in Greensboro may not have any familiarity with this binary until they are situated in the community for some time. And so for international populations, it's also critical to also gain some awareness of your social landscape, whether that's about race, ethnic origin, gender or gender identity, sexuality, whatever it is. It's important for us to become aware if we are not yet aware. Any other questions or comments to this point about the working definition of privilege and awareness or lack thereof? Okay. So now it's important to talk about becoming socially aware as a public volunteer.
Uh,
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there some?
I guess I was muted there.
Oh,
I wanted to share this with you.
sure.
And with the whole group, I think one of the things that I've found interesting about myself and also my wife, Lavina, that as we get older, we get more progressive and actually more liberal, because the longer we live, the more we see things in life that have not changed in terms of the unfairness around us. So I know as you get older, you're supposed to get more conservative, but it's not working that way. The other thing that's come along with that is both of us, my wife and I, this matter of white privilege wasn't even on our radar until a couple years ago. And now it's very much so. And I just realized that being born with white skin has given me a leg up. And I had I don't know, that never really registered with me. And so, I look at this awareness word up here, and that's why I'm bringing this up. I think a lot of people just need to be educated and need to be sure that they're interacting with other people, that they're open-minded, that they're good listeners, and that they really care about what others have to say and what their situation is. And I share that, not in any way except to say that it's never too late to become aware and to learn.
Indeed. And I think that is one of the beautiful things about becoming a public volunteer, is that because you work on behalf of an entire city, it's kind of a built-in opportunity to become more aware. Now, let me say this before we move to the next part of the workshop. Becoming aware does not mean forsaking thoughts and ideologies that you think are critical to who you are. But it is about being very, very aware of the fact that there are thoughts and ideologies that may not resonate with yours at all, and how to respectfully represent all parts of the population, whether there is alignment with like life outlook and ideologies or not. That kind of brings me to an example that I didn't share yesterday, regretfully, because it just came to me. I was having a conversation ages ago now with a group of public safety members, just casually. It wasn't like a workshop or anything like that. And we were talking about how important it is to be open-minded if you're going to be in public safety and be in public service, but especially public safety. And I said, I remember some time ago being in a workshop, this was even further back than that, I said, where there was some angst, some frustration from some officers who said, I don't mean any harm, but it frustrates me when I walk in a home in subsidized housing where you learn that people don't work all day and their homes look 20 times better than my home, and I can't even be with my kids, on any kind of regular basis because I'm taking all the overtime and off-duty work and everything that I can just to provide. And so I remember asking the question. I said, let me guess, you walk in nice furniture? It's like, yeah. I was like, big flat screen, you know, TV. And I said, you know, nice shoes, like kids tend to throw shoes around and whatnot. He was like, yeah, he said, and I, you know, I don't know how to feel because, you know, I don't want to say anything bad, but it just frustrates me that I work this hard and you know, my kids don't even have those shoes and, you know, so forth and so on. And I said, well, let me ask you something. I said, when you went in that house, you know, the age range of the kids, were any of them teens? He was like, yeah. I was like, you got teens? He was like, yeah, I got one teen, you know. And I was like, okay. I said, so when you go in that house and you see those teens, kind of reminds you of your house. And he was like, yeah, well, I mean, you know, rowdy, whatever else. I said, yeah. I said, well, here's the thing. I said, when I was a teen, my mom really had an expectation that my house would be the cool house. I was like, and part of the reason for that was because she knew that she could look after me, especially because I was technically an only kid. You know, she could look after me and know that, you know, the company that I kept and that we were all, you know, safe and making decent choices, at least, if not the best choices. But all of that to say, my mom wanted to be sight unseen. And she knew that if I had the cool house that kids like to come to, you know, then that worked in her favor. And he was like, yeah, I totally get that. He's like, my wife tries to do the same thing with our house, you know, basement, you know, this and third. And I said, so if you take away the subsidized housing and a person's work schedule, how are you different from that parent? I said, does it occur to you perhaps that they want to be the cool house too? Because after all, if you look at all this statistical stuff and all of these stereotypes, their neighborhoods sometimes are most impacted by, you know, wayward behavior or whatever. So, you know, if that is the way that they're thinking about it, then why would they not want the nice furniture and the cushy couches and the big TV? Because then maybe, just maybe, they'll know where their kid is, you know, when the street lights go off because all the friends are piled up over there. And maybe, just maybe, since, you know, sneakers and brands are a thing, if they can keep their kids from being, you know, teased or bullied by about what they have on, then their kids have a shot of flourishing at school instead of getting sent home for fighting. And then maybe, just maybe, they'll be able to go forth and develop professionally, whether that's going to college or not. You don't have to go to college to be successful, but then maybe they could be in housing that isn't subsidized one day. And so he leans back and he's like, huh. I say, yes, I don't think any of us are that different. And so where the awareness had to come in was where there were similarities, because the perception about difference made it easy to gaze in and say that, you know, these are all the things that are wrong with the way that your system runs. Your value system's off. If you worked, maybe you wouldn't live in subsidized housing. If you didn't live in subsidized housing, you know, maybe XYZ. And so I just spent some time kind of dialing back, because it is about learning the nuances of other people's experiences, as opposed to these blanket assessments about who deserves what and why. It sounds really responsible to earn every dime you've got and spend it on all of the right things, but many of us have some retail therapy in us from time to time. The difference is if we have substantial enough incomes where no one really knows the degree of our retail therapy, then we're not judged. But for the person who appears to be in lack who engages in retail therapy, then we make decisions about whether their value system is substantial in order to have a good life. These are the types of things that awareness, being educated by those around you, will enlighten you to. It doesn't mean it's going to convert you in everything that you think about everything. You may still think retail therapy is just the worst, you know, and that all people who do it are wasteful. Maybe so. But at least the stigmas associated with who should have a right to and who shouldn't, those kinds of things, can be leveled just a little bit.
So, Love, I do have a quick comment. Chuck
Sure.
and Cheryl McQuarrie said in the chat that regarding access, one way to make sure everyone has access to boards and commissions is to have each board or commission publish their minutes. Not all do this, and this supports transparency, which I think is a good point.
Absolutely. So the other part of access is about being able to get information to people. And so if you're talking from a technical perspective about how people are granted better access, transparency is certainly a critical piece of that equation.
If I could also add something to the point of privilege,
Sure.
I think it's often a very offensive statement if you don't understand what it means, which is why I like the way you define it as not being aware. I think you said in the training yesterday that most people, we believe that we've earned what we have and that we're entitled to it. But there are some things that we've never earned. So I don't have citizenship. I wasn't born here. And for those of you that were born here, I think sometimes the anxiety around your immigration status can be lost. It can be a little bit forgotten in conversations. I've lived here for almost 20 years, but I am very nervous having a green card. And so I will become naturalized. I've got my application ready and I'm going to send it in by Monday because on October 2nd, the price doubles. And these are just things that those of you that were born here have never had to think about. So to Commissioner Culler's point, I'm white. And I know that as an immigrant, my whiteness has given me a completely different experience than maybe Sidiga or Zaina that are also on this call. So sometimes there are things you can't help it. It's not anything to feel guilty about. It's just your reality, and understanding and accepting that there's no threat there. Kind of takes the sting out of that word privilege that I think a lot of people feel.
Thank you for pointing that out, Jody, because there is a sting that sometimes is assumed around the term privilege, and that's why to that last bullet on the previous slide is being unaware necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes there's moments where you don't even know that you are privileged, and it is that moment of enlightenment. You know, some people say, well, I don't feel privileged. I struggled for everything I've got, but struggle is relative. And so, you know, I don't see my education attainment as a privilege on the one hand. I just see it as something that I chose to do, but to someone else, it reads differently. So thank you for pointing that out. I see some more comments coming in the chat. Before I move forward, I just want to make sure that, that I'm respectful of those who are weighing in.
Nope, there's nothing in there. Mayor Vaughn said, good luck, Jody, which I really appreciate because it is a nerve-wracking process.
Absolutely.
No. Thank you.
So we're talking about awareness now, because we've defined privilege as being unaware. And now we're talking about the fact that awareness as a public volunteer involves this idea of privileged responsibility, the opportunity to be aware because you make decisions or you deliberate over things on behalf of other people. So there are a couple of steps or a couple of ideas to take into consideration when you're talking about becoming socially aware. The first is to remember the margin and whose behalf are you working on. So again, I said earlier, in theory, we would like for there not to be a such thing, most of us would anyway, such thing as a margin and a center, but there is. And so since there is, it's important to think when you do the work that you do, are you working on behalf of the center or are you working on behalf of the margin? And ideally, you would be working on behalf of both. Many times in these workshops, people assume that the whole push is to just work towards the margin, work for the people who are at the fray. But the reality is that Greensboro is the machine that it is in working order when all who are appointed are working on behalf of everyone. So whether a person happens to be privileged or happens not to be privileged, the key is to take both of those spaces into consideration in the work you do. Even if you were appointed because of the community that you live in, your district, and the assumption that you represent the ideology of your district, if you really understand the demographic of each district in this city, there's diversity in every demographic. It might not be in a particular neighborhood, But even there's diversity. Diversity is everywhere. But if we're talking about those kind of standard or stereotypical notions of diversity, even if it doesn't reach beyond your neighborhood, it certainly represents your district. And if you were chosen or appointed by someone who's at large, then all the more it's important to have some sort of intelligible understanding of who lives among us. You know, who are my neighbors? What are their experiences? So it's important to distinguish between your standpoint, to the second bullet, and of advocacy and improvement, and those for whom you advocate, okay? Because your standpoint may say, we need more of this in our community in order for everyone to thrive, especially those who have less privilege. And those who may sit in the seat of lesser privilege say, no, actually, that's not what I would have put at the top of the list of what would make my experience in Greensboro better. And so even if you stand firm in your position about what's needed, understand the difference between your interpretation of what's needed and what the person who is experiencing this lack of privilege might determine is needed. And many times that is what will help us distinguish between this next point, which is good enough versus best. As a decision maker on a board or a commission, you discuss things. And at the end of that discussion, there are going to be recommendations to council or education back out to the community or some variation thereof. And in the end, you've got a product, whether that's a recommendation or whatever it is. And that product is either good enough or it's the best. And many times in being socially aware as a public volunteer, even if you have to make a decision that falls in that good enough category, it's important to be able to articulate why one didn't achieve the best. And we have a council member on the call who lives this day in and day out, because, you know, as a leader, there are decisions that are made. And sometimes it's like, this is what we would love to have for everyone in Greensboro. This is as good as it's going to get on this particular topic or this particular item. What's missing in between good enough and best is usually an explanation. So back to whoever made the recommendation about transparency in minutes and things like that, that's why that's so important, because sometimes people can be okay with the decision that's not the very best if they at least know how you got there. Because you many times have policies, procedures, red tape that become a challenge. And in those challenges, you have to think about, well, one, does this policy or procedure have to stick that's creating a barrier? And if it does, then we at least need to be able to explain plainly to the public how this barrier is the reason why we couldn't shoot for and deliver best, as opposed to, well, it's a little complicated and, you know, perhaps, you know, you wouldn't understand. I mean, it's a lot of red tape. It's a lot of policy. It's a lot of, you know, those are buzzwords that don't rest well on the heart of the public, especially when it comes to access to resources and opportunities, if they're not getting the best. And that means that you've got to think about this notion of the majority, because a lot of times what distinguishes good and best is some sort of quantifying of access to a resource or an opportunity. And that's not necessarily ideal. So I'll give an example. We live in a minority-majority city, which means that numerically, whether it's Blacks, members of different ethnicities, you know, part of different international populations, et cetera, Black and brown, that statistically there are more Black and brown people in this city than whites. And so there are sometimes specific barriers that impact Black and brown people in a particular way. And some of those barriers are not necessarily discriminatory on their face. It's not saying no blacks, no browns, that's not allowed. It's more like, in order to qualify, you have to have met this criteria. And overwhelmingly, from a statistical lens, many Black and brown people are not able to meet that particular criteria. And so then when you make a statement like this worked for the majority of whom and under what circumstance? Because there could be moments where it was worth it to explore the policy's impact on different populations as opposed to just taking the policy on face value. And an example of that Jody mentioned on yesterday, that I was really grateful that she mentioned in the work that we've had to do in our office, is with the International Advisory Committee. 4 or 5, maybe 5 years ago, I was just walking in the door, maybe only been here 1.5 years, 2 years as the Director of Human Relations. And so one of the things that was on deck was the revitalization of the International Advisory Committee. And this is a subcommittee of the Human Relations Commission that is designed to examine the needs of the international community and then pursue resources and opportunities and, explore policy, et cetera, on their behalf. And so as this group was being revitalized, there was a rule in the ordinance that said that the only way that a chair could be appointed to the IAC, or the International Advisory Committee, was by way of the chair of the Human Relations Commission. So the same way that the chair of the HRC chose a person over any other subcommittee, they also had the sole authority to appoint a chair to the IAC. Well, we had just recently followed that protocol and appointed a chair who happened to be of international descent, who then had to abruptly step out of the role because I think maybe relocation of a job opportunity or something like that. And so the next person that was appointed by way of the chair was a person who was a service provider a very well-known service provider to the international community, but was not of international descent. And there was significant pushback because then the other responsibility was to choose the other officers. And of the majority of the officers, most of them were white or Black who worked in service provision roles to the international community, but only maybe one member of the executive board was of international descent. And so there was some serious pushback. And the initial theory was, well, this will work for the group because these are people that they've trusted, tried and true. Many of them work, throughout the international community. And so that's definitely more ideal than a person who's coming in who hasn't done any work with the international community. Voila. Well, the members of the international community were like, no, thank you. Not interested. And they said, it's not that we have anything against those service providers who are in those executive roles, but they only participate in our experience, but they don't live our experience. We don't want a whole executive board of people who've never lived in the skin of an immigrant or a refugee, because the way in which we have to matriculate into this country and learn customs and adjust and adapt, that's something that you can only learn firsthand. Helping me do that as a service provider, that's not my lived experience. Well, what was my counter? I said, well, I understand your desire, but according to the ordinance says that the chair of the HRC does the sole selection. So I understand why you're concerned, but I'm really sorry. We have to follow the city ordinance. Well, they were like, that's lovely, but I said what I said, and this isn't working. And so for weeks, there was deliberation with the Human Relations Commission where they were asking, do you even think it's appropriate that it's written that way in the ordinance? Do you have to abide by the ordinance, or is it not your job to kind of pick through this policy, through this procedure to see if there's another way? And in the end, there was a complete change. Now the International Advisory Committee does a public election every 2 years where all of the executive board is elected by popular vote. And that was a change that was birthed out of calling to question policy and procedure on behalf of the majority. So many times we have to think about, good enough was that we had followed policy and procedure, but best was that we took some time to sit and pick apart that policy and procedure to see if there was a better way. And indeed there was. So a big part of becoming socially aware is to, again, think about who you're working on behalf of. And then, let's explore those definitions of good enough and best and explain why sometimes we can't arrive at best. And then in instances where we can, push the envelope in order to do so on behalf of an appropriate understanding of the majority, which is the majority of the population in Greensboro, not just the majority of people who are like us. Another part of becoming socially aware is considering voice and process for engagement. A question came up on the call yesterday. How do you get voices to the table if we see that there's not enough representation, amongst those of us who sit on a commission or on a board? How do we engage people? I said, well, that varies. First and foremost, think about what people of different lived experiences have to deal with as barriers to getting to the table. We've got a good, robust handful of people, pre-COVID especially, who come to council meetings for speakers from the floor, and they speak on their own behalf. They sign up, they get their 3 to 5 minutes, to share their perspective, and they get to move on. But what about people who are working during every council meeting, working during every commission meeting, et cetera? You got to consider, if you don't have access to invite the voice to the table, then how do you get to the voice? And so that's one of those things that you may want to grapple with as a commissioner or as a board member. When I realize voices are absent, when I become aware that certain voices are absent, how do I pursue those voices? And you have to remember that you brand yourself in the way that you engage community voice. A lot of times when decisions are made, people want to have evidence of the fact that there was an effort to get other voices to the table. And if too frequently your board or your commission is pegged as not welcoming different voices to the table, eventually that becomes your brand. It becomes your brand as a collective, but it also becomes your brand as an individual. When you say you represent that board or commission, if there hasn't been the due diligence to welcome that plethora of voices to the table, or to go to the voices if nothing else, then that's how people understand the work of that body. So whatever that is, good, bad, or indifferent, you have to become aware of the fact that that's what's happening, depending upon your choices about engagement. And finally, part of being socially aware as a commissioner or a board member is realizing that you brand yourself by social media. Now, there are a few fail-safes when it comes to social media and being in public service. Usually they say just post pictures of your kids, grandkids, say nothing at all, and just basically be a cyber social media, spy. Like, just look at your other friends' pictures, look at your other friends' vacations, look at your other friends' comments, but just don't make any comments of your own and you're safe. You're fine. Just don't say anything. Well, the truth of the matter is that it's not necessarily that. It's not about going mute, but it is about understanding that whatever brand you create will not easily be erased. So when you take platform on social media in order to articulate your opinions, your views, your stances about things, especially in public service, and people know that you're a public service volunteer, you have to be aware of the fact that if you opt out of any version of censoring and you choose to say things that may be more or less popular on a particular topic, that there are always branding repercussions for that. And so, many times in my work, and Jody can attest to this because there was a season where she was over commissions, we did a whole lot of running and sliding into home base, trying to get people to think about what they had posted. And in some instances, think about if they wanted to leave it up on their page. We very often were like, yikes, let's call this person. Let's see if that's really the message they want to convey. Or, you know, we've had to pull people from program panels because of the choices that they've made as far as the soapboxes they've chosen to stand on. And that is the kind of thing that when you say that you serve 270 some odd thousand people, you have to think about whether your messages would rest well on the hearts of 270 some odd thousand people. So your counter is love? Of course not. I don't expect everything I say to rest well on everyone's heart, granted. And that is fair. But it's also important to understand the relationship between how that rests on the hearts of the public and then what that means for you being trusted to do the work on behalf of a board or a commission, whatever that message may be. I want to stop here and give the opportunity because I saw the chat flickering just a little bit. So I want to check in with Jody just to see if there are questions or comments that have been posted.
Commissioner Kohler made the point we all need to work on being better listeners than talkers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really good point. I have had a request for someone to send the recording. I will try to figure out how to do that. This session and yesterday's were recorded. So we'll either, I guess we could share it to a social media site. You can find it there. But let me talk with Love and find out exactly how we can send that out. The tech might be a challenge because this is going to be a really big file. Really it took me about half an hour to convert it from Zoom yesterday. So, and that was it, Love.
Okay.
One other thing I'd like to say that I think if everybody who's on a board or commission would realize that it's not about them, that they're representing the city of Greensboro, and they need to represent Greensboro in such a way that that reflects positively on the city, and that we are all, as board members or commission members, we are all public relations people. And people carry personal agendas into meetings, which I think is a huge mistake. And if they'd realize that it isn't about them, but it's about serving others, and that mutual respect needs to be, I think, a corner piece to everything we do. And if we focus on mutual respect, I don't think we can ever get far off base.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Kohler. It is important to think about motivation. One of the things that has come out of some of my reflections, right? These little nuggets that I'm sharing from like age 12, age 15, et cetera, is that my understanding and my interpretation of the world and the fabric thereof was established very early, even earlier than the stories that I tell about myself. And so that's the case for each of us. We all have a framework coming into public service. And that also means that that framework has shaped your motive. What drives you to do the work that you do, your encounters, your experiences, et cetera. And so I do want to acknowledge the fact that some of those past experiences influence motive and therefore influence how you come into the work and how your personal agenda is established. When I was about 9, I opened up, I'd gotten a new journal, and just 2 years ago, I found the journal, and it had an excerpt written around my birthday, which is in January, about how frustrated I was at these little boys in my fourth grade class who were laughing during the Martin Luther King video, as I age myself, because yes, it was on VHS, I was very upset about these little boys who laughed and played during the whole film that we watched in class about Martin Luther King, and they were mocking him during the I Have a Dream speech, which was my favorite part. And I literally wrote in this journal as a kid at age 9 that I really just didn't understand what was so funny, and that I really thought it was immature, and that we should really respect the contributions of Dr. King. I actually have a picture of the journal entry in my phone. And it reminds me that I was built for this work from the beginning, that I've always been wired looking at stuff through this lens of human rights and having a value for it. So when I come into the room, more often than not, to do this work, that's what's driving me. The fact that I have an authentic passion for equity, a genuine passion for diversity, inclusion. I'm wired this way. So it's important for all of us to think about how we're wired when we come in to do public service work. And I'm not saying that everyone has to be in love with every word that dripped off the tongue of Martin Luther King, though I can't see how one wouldn't be. But on the other hand, I'm not saying that's the case, because we know that we have some frameworks that are very contradictory to the thought and philosophy of Dr. King. But wherever you stand, it's important to think about how that drives the work that is done. And are you doing the work on behalf of the whole city based on whatever your motivation is, based on whatever your agenda is? I see 2 hands that were raised. Yeah.
Sidiga?
Linda Lane here. I'm referring back to the part in the beginning about privilege. I found something I would like to share with the group.
Sure.
In his book, quote, Showing Up for Life, Thoughts on the Gifts of a Lifetime, unquote, 2009, Mr. Gates Sr. wrote, quote, those who claim that the wealth they have accumulated is theirs to pass on without returning anything back to the American system show a shocking lack of appreciation for all that the system and public monies did to help them create wealth, unquote. That says a lot.
What does it say to you, Linda?
That there are those privileges that you may or may not have been aware of growing up or at some point in your life, that you have benefited in a way that gives you privilege. And therefore, it's incumbent to share that wealth, either knowledge or money or foundations or whatever, but you must give back in some way. And that really means a lot to me.
Thank you for sharing that, Linda. Thank you.
I think, yeah, Sidiga also had her hand up. Sidiga, did you want to share something?
No, not right now. This is was before when I made the comment.
Okay, wonderful. And then we've got Chuck and Cheryl McQuarrie.
This is Cheryl McQuarrie. You know, I think the way the city crafts boards and commission charters also has an impact on helping each board member or commission member become aware of the needs of the people they serve. And I'll give you an example. I serve on the Greensboro Transit Advisory Commission. We used to be an authority, which meant we had more opportunity to have an impact on the public transit system in Greensboro. We would have riders come and talk to us, express concerns, raise frustration, give plaudits to drivers, schedules, routes, etc. When the city council redid that charter, it made that organization one where you only recommend to the city council. Many of the boards and commissions are in that role. You recommend to the city council what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, the riders no longer come to our meeting. They have learned they have to go to the city council to make their concerns made. And 9 times out of 10, somebody will say, well, I really don't know about that. I'm going to have to check and get back to you. And maybe they do, and maybe they don't. And the citizen walks away unfulfilled because they don't get an answer. And certainly now in the time of coronas, where the city council does not have the opportunity to have someone come and address them directly and have somewhat of a dialogue, then that also shuts down awareness for those of us that serve. We have about 3,000, 4,000 trips on public transit, and trying to get to know all of the people that use public transit is a bit of a challenge. You can do it. You can ride and talk to folks. But the impact of how the city crafts the charter of each of these commissions, I feel, contributes to the success that you have in serving the citizens who are customers of the boards and commissions.
Thank you for that. So one of the things that is good about this kind of discussion is that you can also present, the things that you think are challenging or successful about the actual framework of the commissions as far as being sensitive or inclusive, just as much as you're talking about your process and how you engage with members of the community. So, those are equally critical points to share, for sure. Jody, are there any other comments in the...
Not in the chat. There was someone that had their hand up that is showing up as Samsung. I don't see a name attached to it, but it says Samsung SM. And
yes,
then
I'm Vita Howell on the Community Sustainability Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wanted to go back to the point from Mr. Gates' book, and that is that no one is self-made, and that if we are all aware that none of us are self-made, it opens the possibilities for more cooperation.
Yes, so it's also important to, and thank you for that. It's also important to think about, what are our definitions of success? What are our definitions of thriving? What are our definitions of, our thoughts about seizing opportunity? All of that drives the way in which we come to the table and make decisions on behalf of other people. There is a book, it's relatively popular, by Thomas Shapiro called Toxic Inequalities. And there is a chapter called The Inheritance Advantage that tells the story of a couple that makes $70,000 a year, but because they received $1 million inheritance, they were able to comfortably afford a $500,000 home that then appreciated to the tune of $750,000 in 2 years. And they were able to fully furnish it and really live a lifestyle that didn't represent their income at all. As a matter of fact, the professions of choice, I believe, were teacher and something else that together, like that each person made no more than $35,000 a year in whatever work that they did. But they lived in a community where homes averaged anywhere from $500 to $1 million. And so when you think about that, it's definitely the case to consider that people arrive at advantage in different ways, which means people also arrive at disadvantage in different ways. Some of it may be innate around, or what is perceived as disadvantage, I should say. Some of it may be innate, things that circumstances people were born into, while other things may be more about life choices and things that happen to people to change the course of their personal history. In either case, as a board member or as a commissioner, it is important to take into consideration that we don't know how people arrive at particular circumstances, positively or negatively. And so therefore, when we do the work, it's important to check biases that may very well influence the way in which we make decisions. And so with that being said, the last part of this workshop that I want to address is about addressing bias in public volunteerism. So first and foremost, the picture here to the side says, be a doer. And the reason that that's there is because of the fact that public volunteerism and checking or addressing bias has to be action driven as a public volunteer. It's beyond reflection. It's beyond conversation. It is about an actual action. And so I want to park first at the 2 points about reflection and conversation. I've already stated that, it's important to think about what drives your work. It's important to think about what drives the way in which you see the world. I had many beautiful experiences about being a budding Black young lady, now woman, in the world growing up, but I also had encounters like with my friend whose father didn't want me to ever come back to their home. And it was a critical fork in the road for me. And you might say, well, which road did you travel? I chose both. I am equally proud and very, very, very committed to being respected for being a Black woman in America. But I am also very much so equally aware of the fact that not all white people or people of any other ethnicity or nationality or race think that Black people are bad. And so I'm also equally committed to developing alliances for people who promote inclusion. I am both. And so the reflection piece is what helps me realize where I stand, my experiences and how they influenced where I stand. But the conversation piece is where the work of being a commissioner or a board member becomes, another step towards action. So yesterday on the call, the question was asked, when you discover that people are unaware, what is your duty to make them aware? Are you not supposed to tell them, or do you shy away from telling them? And I said, well, most certainly the key is to enlighten, because if you're making decisions on behalf of an entire city and you don't know the city on behalf of which you're making the decisions, it's important to learn that. What I did emphasize, though, is that usually what influences the degree to which people wish to be enlightened is how you enlighten. Now, when I speak of that circumstance, that instance with the International Advisory Committee, they tried being really pleasant and humble at first. They were like, hey, Love, hey, Human Relations Commission, hey, City of Greensboro. This isn't the most workable set of circumstances that this entire executive body really doesn't represent us. Just want to let you know. And one might say that that was a nice, kind of acceptable tone with which to enlighten people, et cetera, and that's the ideal way to communicate. But the challenge is that I, along with others, happen to be very committed to the policy and procedure. So they were like, hey, just want to let you know just one more time that this doesn't work. And so then after a third time of being referred to the policies and procedures, they said the whole system just doesn't work. It's garbage and we're not happy. And it is unethical for you to think that we should be happy. And Jody mentioned yesterday on the call that at some point I had to decide, as well as many others, that this wasn't personal. So I didn't have to police one's tone and say only if you ask nicely or you should be more pleasant in your plea. It was about realizing that in their initial petition that had been a little more mild, if you will, that they didn't feel heard. And so to the question yesterday about do you confront? Yes. And there are various outcomes based on how one chooses to confront. But to Jody's point, it was very much about understanding that the degree to which a group wants you to listen is going to influence how amplified they are in the way that they try to get your attention, especially as a board member, especially as a commissioner. And so the conversation becomes vital because it's the only way that you learn that there's another perspective sometimes. It's maybe due to ignorance, maybe due to a lack of consideration. In either side of the spectrum, sometimes your attention has to be jolted, and whether that's through a mild conversation or something way more assertive, the reality is that after the reflection about where you stand on things and what drives your work, you have to begin to engage in conversation with people so that you can hear multiple perspectives. But all of that is supposed to lead to an action point. Now, some actions are limited, and as a board member or as a commissioner, the word recommendation is really what's on the table in many instances, right? You make a recommendation to council, you make a recommendation to the public, but it's not that you are always going to be the end-all, beat-all decision makers. But those recommendations matter, and those recommendations need to be thoughtful, and those recommendations are actions. And I want board members and commissioners to hear and understand that regardless of what may happen to that recommendation once it's in the hands of our highest, decision-making authority in the city, the action to get the recommendation to that authority is really important. And many times people want to see that bias has been broken down, not just hear or believe it. So it requires action steps. So what's the starting place? Commissioner Kohler said it early on in the conversation, and it's not rocket science. Listen, but to whom? Because sometimes in board and commission meetings, we listen for hours, but to whom are we listening? Here in this bullet, it's recommended that you listen to the most directly impacted. If it's a decision about zoning, if it's a decision about access to libraries, if it's a decision about whether or not to create a resolution to support DACA, whatever it is, who is most impacted and have you heard their voices? So it's about being intentional about getting to those voices. And sometimes, like I said, it's about going to places where conversations are happening, even if you're not the one spearheading the conversation. Your board or commission may want to tackle the topic all day long, but you're only able to talk amongst each other because none of the represented voices are at the table. So then who are your ambassadors from the commission that are going to go to other places, community meetings, neighborhood meetings, etc., where the conversation is already happening, and then report back to this group so that you're better informed? That is being sensitive to the experiences of others, sensitive enough to want to go and hear those experiences. But then also be thoughtful. After you hear voices, hearing other voices is one thing, but be really thoughtful about what that means. If you hear people say over and over that there's a policy or there's a procedure or there's criteria that makes access to a thing or an opportunity impossible, then be thoughtful when you go back and engage with your group and say, well, we know we may or may not have enough authority to change this particular way in which this policy is written or this procedure is written, but we definitely know it to be our duty to recommend that this policy be reviewed, that this procedure be assessed, etc. And then when in doubt, research. Working on behalf of a whole city doing human rights work, I am behind the curve all the time. There's always a unique experience, a nuance that I'm like, well, I think I know enough about that, but I can't say that I do fully, and especially how that rubs up against a process or a procedure. So we've got a community group right now, that's interested in looking at disparity for specific populations, a specific population in question. And one of the things that happened when the recommendation came to the table to create this working group was, where else are they doing it? Where else is this kind of work happening? So before we walk into a situation where someone would say no, because we've never done it that way here, at least we can talk about the way that it's been done other places. And hopefully that might open a door for why we can do it that way here. So sometimes when you're in doubt about whether or not there's ever been anyone to review the way that a policy or a procedure is exclusive, creates barriers, pushes people to the margin, and not bringing them to the center, do research. Who on your commission or on your board is interested enough in the topic to go do a little bit of homework so that you can have a well-informed discussion? That's how bias is addressed. That's how addressing bias becomes an action. And the last thing is to simply mind your vote. Many times as a commissioner or as a board member, you don't realize the power of not just discussing a topic, but weighing in on record how you feel or what you think about the change that does or doesn't need to happen. And so being sensitive to the reality that your vote is then going to impact whether something is recommended to council or not, especially if it's something that the community really needs, to see that relationship between all of those pieces and parts, my all in favor, aye, or opposed, it has a ripple effect for the lived experience of people outside of myself in the community. And so even if you have a biased view, because we all have some sorts of bias, even if we have biased views, it's important to make sure that we don't commit to biased votes as much as possible, that it's not driven just based on our slant on the world, but it is based on the needs of the community. And so with that being said, I want to open the floor again for questions, and I'm going to stop screen share so that I can see as many faces as possible for those who are on the call. But this is an opportunity. I like to leave a certain window open if there are questions, thoughts, concerns, or considerations about any part of what's been discussed today as it relates to sensitivity as a board or commission member. General comments and or questions. Sue, are you talking? Okay,
yeah, how's that?
Okay, there we go.
Had to bring it down, yeah. Hey, I've just joined the Parks and Rec board, and so I've just been to one meeting, so this is kind of pretty new for me. But I just wanted to say thank you for just your insights and your stories. It really helps when you speak from, things that have happened to you, and this has been a great 2 hours to spend on a Friday afternoon.
Well, thank you. And I promise you I didn't pay Sue.
She didn't.
But no, thank you, Sue. That's my intent, for it to be, worthwhile. Everything may not rest well as far as how one may see the world, but at least it jogs thought and process about how others see the world. Other comments, other questions?
I have one. Is the city council considering increasing the pay for boards and commissions?
Yes, we're going to double it.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy. I figured that was coming.
You're welcome.
You've heard that before, I'm sure.
Yes, sir, we have.
Love, this is Marcia Glazeman. I've been listening. I'm on the Parks and Rec Commission. I too wanted to thank you immensely. It's been a long time since I sat in on a wonderful workshop such as what you put on this afternoon. I've often told many people of all of my years in Greensboro, 31 years, and the 2 commissions that I've served on, the Parks and Rec now and the Human Relations Commission. One of the most powerful workshops that I ever took was one of the Undoing Racism workshops. It left a profound, emotional, thought processing, provoking, just something to really think about. And I so enjoyed so many of the points you made today. It sort of brought me back to that place again. And I wanted to thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for your feedback. I saw in the chat, it popped up that Brian Crean gave some kudos in the chat. And so thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. I certainly do. Like I said, this is waking up for me in the morning. I really love what I do, no pun intended. And so I certainly appreciate the opportunity. Mayor Vaughn, did I interrupt you?
No, I just wanted to say thank you very much for putting this on today and yesterday. And it is just the beginning. I know that we've got a lot of work to do. I look forward to the new commission that is being put together, the Ad Hoc Commission on African American Disparities. I want to thank all of the commissioners that were here today. And I know there was a group yesterday for your volunteerism. The city wouldn't run if it wasn't for all of the great volunteers that we have on the boards and commissions, and for the other things that our volunteers help us with, whether it's the festivals and all of the other great events that we have throughout the year. Of course, this has been a very unusual year for us, but this is really the first of many. Like Marcia mentioned, the Undoing Racism. There are other great opportunities that will be available the end of this year and next year. So just stay tuned. This is kind of a precursor for more to come. I want to thank you for ending your week with a workshop like this. But Love, thank you for you and your staff for putting this together.
Absolutely. Our pleasure. And the only other thing that I would add as a charge coming away from this, Jody and I did a little math before getting on the call this afternoon. And we said, in total between yesterday and today, we've seen about 70 members of our boards and commissions. So that's roughly about half. And so what I would ask is that those of you who represent boards and commissions and, you'll be going back to those meetings, pay this information forward, share what you heard today, reference the fact that there is a recording, and we're going to do our best to make it available, but definitely, let people know what you heard today. Your honest feelings about what you heard today, just if nothing else as a conversation starter to get a pulse, because it's important to know those who labor among you, right? And so this is an opportunity to just kind of, get the conversation started about sensitivity, culturally, ethnically, et cetera, on behalf of boards and commissions. And again, the sign of a good facilitator is knowing that when the clock winds down, and the questions slow down, you too should slow down. And I just want to make sure that everyone's questions are answered. Feel free to put things in the chat, but that concludes our workshop for today. And thank you so much. I genuinely appreciated working with each of you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Take
care.
care.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, everyone have a good weekend.